Association of Iranian Political Prisoners in Exile for honoring me with this invitation. I'm really very pleased to see that there is such a group in Sweden that has organized itself, mobilized itself to make sure that this tragic and cowardly crime is not forgotten. And I also extend my heartfelt appreciation to our Swedish friends who are here as an expression of solidarity in the struggle to achieve justice. It's really very difficult to follow the previous two speakers who I think have done an excellent job both of speaking about the intimate reality of what it means to have survived such a tragic experience and also what the steps ahead are. So I would like to share with you perhaps some broader reflections on the challenge that the 1988 mass killings presents to us, how we need to understand it in a philosophical and moral perspective, how we need to understand it in a broader political perspective of what the policy of the international community is towards Iran, and then to reflect on the practical steps that we can take following on what my dear friend and colleague Kaveh Shahruz said about the absence of legal mechanisms today for bringing to justice the perpetrators. Edmund Burke, the 18th century English writer, famously remarked, "All that it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing." And we have to remember, at the end of the day, in the contest between those that have no reservations about taking the lives of 4,000 people away, and those of us who 20 years later are still responding to the cry of those people from the grave, that we have a very important role to play in ensuring that evil does not triumph. And what we speak of when we look at the mass murder of 4,000 people, a cold-blooded, premeditated, deliberate mass murder, is what Hannah Arendt called radical evil. This is a sort of evil which transcends the ordinary conception that we have of moral wrongdoing. It transcends even the murder that takes place in the heat of passion because of personal hatred and dislike. It is, in many respects, emblematic, symbolic of the excesses of the 1980s, a particularly dark decade for human rights in Iran, when ideologically driven totalitarian tendencies ultimately were consummated in the event that we are here to commemorate. And we have to remember what happened before 1988 and what has happened after 1988, which explains where we stand. Ervand Abrahamian, one of the scholars of modern Iranian history, writes in his book Between Two Revolutions that an estimated 15,000 political prisoners have already been executed by 1985. And the figures, as we know, could vary given the secrecy surrounding the torture chambers of Iran, the executions that took place. So the 4,000 executions that took place in 1988 were, in a sense, the apotheosis, the high point of a decade of bloodletting in which radical Islamist elements resorted to whatever degree of violence was necessary in order to consolidate their power. And the fact that the likes of Ayatollah Montazeri had been critical of the regime's conduct and had even exposed the crimes that were committed should also make us understand that there is nothing mystical or culturally authentic, if you like, about the sort of violence which was legitimized in the name of Islam. This is an absolutist authoritarian regime, no different than the regimes which we have seen in Argentina, in Chile, in South Africa, in so many other countries. It was above all about maintaining power. And I say this because while we have on the one hand sort of the right-wing neoconservative approach towards Islam, suggesting that, well, the Islamic Middle East is inherently backwards, it must be recreated in a Western liberal image, the sort of people that promoted the invasion of Iraq as some way of sort of transforming that society into a Swedish-style social democracy overnight. On the other hand, we have in the sort of politically correct tendencies in the intellectual left, a tendency to be apologetic for what has happened in Iran in the name of saying that we have to understand that each culture has its own distinctiveness, its own history, its own civilization. We should not be passing judgment. And what I would like to submit here is that that is entirely the wrong framework for understanding the excesses of the Islamic Republic from its very inception until today. The methods and crimes which the Islamic Republic has resorted to are not those of medieval Islam. They're those of a modern authoritarian state. Disappearances, tortures, forced confessions, the use of propaganda. One could see the exact same sort of tools being used by authoritarian regimes across the world. And we have to understand that in order to move beyond this notion of cultural exceptionalism, the notion that somehow Iran is unique, that it cannot be looked at as just any other dictatorial regime that has no reservations about brutalizing its citizens in order to maintain itself in power. I also think that the starting point of any sort of consciousness or awareness is for us to move beyond the statistical abstractions. Was it 4,000 people? Was it 3,000? Was it 5,000? These are important from a historical point of view. And as I will explain, the organization that I established together with some colleagues is now moving towards writing a sort of documentary analytical report on the 1988 mass killings to try and shed some sort of clarity on what happened. And the work of people such as my colleague Kaveh Shahruz has been very, very important in this regard. But at the end of the day, we should remember what Joseph Stalin said, that a single murder is a tragedy, but the murder of a million is a statistic. And governments ultimately hide behind abstractions. That is why I want to pay my utmost respect and homage to Mr. Mousavi, through whose anguish, through whose tears, we begin to understand the reality behind the tragedy which we're here to commemorate. Very often we speak about victims as objects of pity, as abstractions, but behind every victim there is a name. Behind every victim is a universe of emotions and relations. Every one of those 4,000 people that were killed was someone's wife, someone's husband, someone's son and daughter, someone's friend and schoolmate. And it's only in putting it in that intimate context that we begin to understand why we have no choice but to fight for justice and to make sure that these crimes are never forgotten, that they are never erased. And this is also why we have to understand, especially in the Iranian diaspora community, where we like to find refuge in the glory of ancient Persia and the poetry of Hafiz and Sadi and Rumi and the great kings of the past, the Sasanian Empire and all of that, we have to understand that in silence we become partners in crime with those who are responsible for this evil. We have to understand that we cannot even begin to think of ourselves as patriots and nationalists, which is something which we like to look at when we fight over the question of whether the Persian Gulf should be called the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, or things of this sort of symbolic nature, but somehow we're willing to turn a blind eye to the murder of 4,000 of our fellow Iranians and still think that we can be great Iranian patriots through token symbols of national identity. So this is a profound challenge, first and foremost, to the Iranian diaspora, to move beyond this complicity and to end the silence, which, as Kaveh pointed out, has allowed the world to turn a blind eye to the 1988 mass killings. Now I'd like to move now from the role of the Iranian diaspora to the role of the international community. The international community has viewed Iran exclusively through the prism of nuclear non-proliferation, energy stability, and regional security, in particular threats against Israel, threats against the Gulf kingdoms. Very rarely has human rights factored into the equation. And when it has, in the form of the European Union dialogue with Iran, or in the form of politically motivated denunciations of Iran's human rights record by the United States, it has not been part of a serious, sustained, integral commitment to democratization in Iran, to the empowerment of civil society. Now, this is a challenge before all of us, once again, in the diaspora, and those who are well-wishers of the Iranian people. But beyond the moral dimension of human rights, we need to understand and emphasize that human rights is not just a matter for naive idealists, those who dream one day that there will be justice and Iran will turn into a paradise, but that without human rights, without democratization, there will never be peace and stability in the Middle East. That all of those issues of nuclear non-proliferation, terrorism, stability of oil supplies, security of Israel, all the issues which the so-called realists in political circles speak about, will never realistically be achieved until the internal transformation of the Iranian regime. And this goes back to what I spoke about in terms of the authoritarian nature of that regime. Authoritarian regimes thrive on violence, thrive on impunity for human rights abuses. They thrive on the creation of enemies. President Ahmadinejad needs George W. Bush. He needs Benjamin Netanyahu. He needs the nuclear issue. He needs to fashion himself as the champion of Islam against the godless West in a contest for supremacy, in an apocalyptic clash of civilizations. And until the international community understands that reality, there will not be an effective policy which will understand the two faces of Iran. The face of Ahmadinejad and the hardliners and the hijab-clad revolutionary with the AK-47 volunteering to be a suicide bomber, the exoticized image which the media very often in the West thrives on because it makes for good news, it's exciting, it's dramatic. But then there is the other Iran, the Iran which is youthful, dynamic, post-ideological, pragmatic, which simply wants economic prosperity and freedom and a normal life. The 70% majority who are 30 years of age and under, who have very little interest in the rhetoric of the Islamic Revolution, who are glued to satellite television, who are internet savvy. And that reality, which includes also one of the most dynamic civil societies, probably the most dynamic civil society in the Middle East, a thriving feminist movement, labor movement, human rights movements, student movements. This other reality of Iran is the only hope which the international community has if it wants to achieve lasting stability. The average Iranian does not wake up in the morning fantasizing about throwing a nuclear bomb on Tel Aviv. The average Iranian wakes up in the morning saying, why do I have to work 4 jobs to feed my family and pay the rent, while the Rafsanjani clan doesn't know what to do with the billions which it has amassed in a corrupt and unaccountable government. It is that reality which the political realists are disregarding. And at the end of the day, a democratic regime which is responsive to its people's needs, which is accountable to its people, will have to answer for bread and butter issues, employment, education, social issues, healthcare. These are the real issues which the Iranian people have to grapple with. And the nuclear issue in the midst of all this is the best gift to the hardliners. Because the one thing that has allowed this government to increase its popularity among those that would otherwise be asking those difficult questions of why in a country with one of the biggest oil supplies in the world are we living in such incredible misery? It gives the regime that one excuse it needs, that we must all rally behind our leader and be unified against the American and Israeli aggressors. And I'm afraid the international community, by focusing exclusively on the nuclear issue, has completely eclipsed the question of human rights and democracy, which is not just a moral problem, but also a political problem. Because until there is a nuanced approach which isolates the hardliners but also empowers the Iranian people, we will have to grapple with an authoritarian regime which has a vested interest in destabilizing, which has a vested interest in creating a conflict and militarization, and where external sort of hostility is intimately linked with internal repression. And we have to understand that the biggest enemy of the Iranian government is not an American military attack, which is probably the best thing that would happen to the regime. The biggest enemy of the regime are the Iranian people. Why else are 18-year-old webloggers being thrown into the torture chambers of Evin prison? 70-year-old scholars like Haleh Esfandiari, scholars of Gandhiism such as Ramin Jahanbeglu, leaders of bus drivers' unions, leaders of women's movements that are simply calling for equal rights. Why is the prison population of Iran filled with such people if the regime has any confidence in its own power? It is clear that civil society is the greatest enemy of the authoritarian regime which is in power. But we have to also understand, getting back to the significance of 1988, that bringing about change is not about, as one of my father's professors, I will say it in Persian and translate it, "Har vaqt yek mush dozde gorosne jay mush dozde si ro migiran besh migim enqilab." The idea that every time a group of hungry thieves take the place of thieves which have satisfied themselves, we call it a revolution. And there's a lesson to be learned about 1979, that a real revolution in the sense of creating political culture is not about simply replacing one group with another. It's about changing the rules of power and legitimacy. It's about creating a culture of human rights. And when in the Iranian community people say 1988 is not important because the victims were mujahideen, well, that demonstrates the poverty of our political culture, where the first question we ask is not that you as a human being have inherent rights. First question we ask is, are you leftist, are you Islamist, are you Baha'i, are you secular? And then we decide whether you should somehow enjoy human rights or not. And my friends, given the fact that I myself am a Baha'i living in exile, I suppose a victim among many others of the Islamist regimes, my friends were in shock when I represented before the United States Supreme Court a case on behalf of a Guantanamo Bay detainee against Donald Rumsfeld. And what is the lesson there? The lesson is that if you begin to start asking questions about who the victim of a human rights violation is, then you have destroyed the entire edifice of human rights. And that is what a human rights culture is about. And that is the only transcendent force that can allow the highly complex, pluralistic, diverse society that Iran is to create the minimal unity that is required to really bring about lasting change. And it's in that context that the 1988 massacres and accountability are of such profound importance. I'm just going to end by emphasizing once again that impunity for the 1988 massacres is part of a continuing transaction. This is not simply a matter of historical curiosity. As our previous speaker indicated, the vast majority of those that were involved in that mass murder ended up being promoted to senior positions within government. Now, what message does that send? This is a message that human rights abuses are a rite of passage. They are a demonstration of one's loyalty to the regime. And you can only imagine what kind of a government you create if those who are responsible for mass murder are the decision makers. I'll regress just briefly to my experience when I worked as a UN war crimes prosecutor for the former Yugoslavia. And like Kave, I was delighted recently to see the arrest of Radovan Karadzic, who I had drafted the indictment for back in 1995 when he was untouchable. The idea that Karadzic would one day be arrested was ridiculous in 1995, and many people ridiculed us at the point, saying that you are dreaming that one day he will be brought to justice. He is untouchable. And we see that he, Slobodan Milosevic, Charles Taylor, and the list goes on and on. Those who are in power today may not be in power tomorrow. And when you have indicted someone for a crime against humanity, then you have stigmatized that person for life. And even if it takes 20 years, 30 years to bring that person to justice, you send a message that that person can never simply sweep everything under the carpet and continue business as usual. Now, in Yugoslavia, there were those who said, in the name of political realism, you have to sweep everything under the carpet and forget about this human rights and justice nonsense, because it gets in the way of negotiations, it gets in the way of stability. Those who really understood the situation on the ground realized that there would never be peace in Bosnia until Radovan Karadzic was removed from political power. And those who realized this were not the human rights advocates and activists, but the political realists who realized that those whose political platform was anti-democratic, those who instigated ethnic hatred and ethnic cleansing as an instrument of power, could never be reliable partners in a peace process. Which goes back to Iran. You want a stable Iran, remove the criminals from positions of power. They are not ever going to be reliable partners. They are never going to be a force for stability, even if you do not care about human rights whatsoever. So when the Security Council adopts a resolution imposing travel bans and asset freeze on those involved in the nuclear program, why isn't the Security Council doing the same thing for those who committed crimes against humanity? Why are people like Said Mortazavi, notorious prosecutor general of Tehran, allowed to travel freely? And here I want to share with you a small story. In Canada, we all know about the story of Zahra Kazemi. Some of you may know about the Canadian-Iranian photojournalist that was brutally tortured and murdered in Evin prison simply for taking photographs of mothers who had come to prison to inquire about their children. After her murder, the Article 90 Commission under the Khatami administration implicated Said Mortazavi, who engaged in a cover-up. And in the 2006 session of the UN Human Rights Council, Said Mortazavi was the head of the Iranian delegation at the UN Human Rights Council. What is the government trying to do? This is a slap in the face of the Iranian people and the international community. It is a message of impunity. For Iran, the man was the message. We are sending Mortazavi to show you that we can commit any atrocity with impunity. A group of us in Canada pressured the Canadian Prime Minister to call for his arrest. And after much pressure, the Prime Minister called for Mortazavi's arrest. He took the first flight back from Geneva to Tehran and has not stepped foot outside of Iran again. And the only reason there, of course, is because we had the good fortune that Zahra Kazemi was a Canadian citizen and there was a basis for the Canadian government to intervene. We have to look at the example of Mykonos. You know that in the 1980s and 90s, almost 300 Iranian political dissidents were murdered in European countries. And very rarely was there an effective investigation or prosecution. In 1992, after Iranian agents murdered Kurdish political leaders in the Mykonos restaurant of Berlin, the Ministry of Justice, to the dislike of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Germany being Iran's biggest trading partner, conducted an investigation and eventually arrested some of the perpetrators and implicated the highest ranks of Iranian leadership in that murder. In 1997, when the ruling came, European Union ambassadors were withdrawn from Tehran and Tehran faced diplomatic isolation. Since 1997, there have been no more political assassinations of Iranian dissidents in Europe. There is a lesson to be learned. If the international community, the Europeans in particular, have a concerted, vigorous, and principled foreign policy, the Iranian leaders will understand that the cost-benefit analysis of using atrocities as an instrument of power has changed. Thus far, the message has been that crime pays. It pays to murder 4,000 people. It pays to torture dissidents because there is no cost attached to it. And it's for us in the diaspora, together with civil society in Iran, and together with friends in the international community, who are both morally inclined and who both understand the only realistic option is the democratic transformation of Iran, to change that calculus. The final thing I will say is, as Kaveh alluded, a group of us established in 2003 the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center in New Haven, which is where Yale University is. And our organization has tried, given the fact that there is not now a legal mechanism for prosecution of these leaders, to prepare highly documented analytical reports, which we then distribute in Iran through a listserv of some 40,000 people in Iran. So we are in effect a sort of truth commission in exile, if you like, because obviously this cannot be done within Iran itself. But if you read these reports, they're clearly not propaganda. They are heavily documented, and the evidence is analyzed in light of international law principles. We are now in the process of doing a report on the 1988 mass killings, which will take whatever documentation is available and analyze it in light of the principles which Kaveh was speaking about later. And the point is that the start of this journey, at the end of which hopefully we will have justice, the start of the journey has to be naming and shaming, identifying those that were responsible, putting the information in the public domain, ensuring that these people never set foot outside of Iran, ensuring that they know that we know who they are, and that even if they are seemingly untouchable today, one day they will be brought to justice. Thank you.